David Brewster here with another Three for All, and this is three Gary Moore licks from 1982. And the late great Irish guitar legend, Gary Moore, is kind of a misunderstood, hero or icon. And depending on how old you are, and what your listening habits are, and also your knowledge of music and music history, some of you watching this might think of Gary Moore as like a blues guitarist, and that's understandable. A lot of the albums he kind of released, later in his career were very blues driven and blues oriented. But really, his career starts all the way back in the late 60s, and he was in a band called Skid Row. And I'm not talking about the Youth Gone Wild, Sebastian Bach Skid Row. This was a different band. But Phil Lynott was actually in Skid Row, and then that kind of led to eventually Gary Moore playing with Thin Lizzy, which I think he joined like around 74, 73, 74, something like that. Worked with Thin Lizzy for a while, and then fast forward to the early 80s, and he released, some solo albums, and they were really successful, and, if you go back and you listen to a lot of rock and hard rock and guitar music, in the late 70s, early 80s, there's a ton of great stuff. Michael Schenker and Scorpions, of course. You've got, Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. And Gary Moore kind of fits in there too, because he had this very, aggressive, speedy, and sweaty, guitar style. I mean, I definitely remember when I was a kid, in magazines, every picture of Gary Moore, he would make this excruciating face, where it looked like he was in pain, and he was always really sweaty. And when I was a kid, I thought, why is he so sweaty, and why does it look like he's in pain? And I didn't understand. Now in the 80s, he released albums like Corridors of Power and Victims of the Future and Dirty Fingers. And then in 1990, he released Still Got the Blues, which has Albert Collins and Albert King and George Harrison's on that album. And that really kind of put him on the map as far as a blues-influenced rock, guitarist. And he really did start to kind of reform his style and his career and kind of shifted more toward blues. And, I mean, that music is phenomenal, but we're going to mainly focus on his early 80s aggressive rock, guitar playing. And there is one album I'm going to recommend. In 93, he was on an album called BBM, which had Jack Bruce, Ginger Baker, and Gary Moore. So it's kind of Gary Moore fitting in Clapton's role, with basically, two of the three members from Cream. And that's a really cool album. I mean, Gary's on fire. The songs are good. It's kind of creamy, esque, I guess. The licks and ideas in this lesson actually come from a song. This is from End of the World, which is on the album Corridors of Power from 1982. And a very, important and famous, kind of guitar showcase, song. It's about 6 or 6.5 minutes long. The first part, is this guitar solo, and then it actually kind of, moves into a song. But we're just going to look at the guitar licks and kind of break down some ideas that are in that song. And I'm going to expand a few of these licks into some variations and also kind of give you, the backstory and kind of expose, where Gary's influence, kind of influenced people like Steve Vai and Nuno Bettencourt and Paul Gilbert and a whole bunch of people. So here we go. It's kind of an interesting video, and you can see there's a ton of smoke, like the fog machines are working overtime. There's a platform that goes up that kind of reminded me of Kiss, and Gary is standing on the platform and you see it rise up, and his name is on this big sign or a big, backdrop or whatever, Gary Moore. And when I saw the footage, I was like, oh my gosh, it's almost like Kiss or something. There's a hydraulic and smoke and all this stuff. I thought, what? But it's rocking, and it's a very important solo. You can definitely hear like a direct influence, from a lot of different guitarists. But to get started, we're actually going to start with a bonus lick. Whoa, I'm throwing out a bonus before we even start. But I wanted to show the opening kind of arpeggiated chord. And even though this is three for all, this is a really good kind of picking warm up. It's not really that demanding for the fret hand. It's really good for the picking hand. So it's a bonus lick I'm throwing in. And on the video, it was actually played on a keyboard. But on the album version, it's actually a muted guitar part. So the keyboard part, on that live footage, it looks and sounds like this. With this intro section, it's really just a 2-chord, progression or implied progression. And the first chord, it's basically an E7 sus2 sharp 5. And then he's going to add this G note there on the 8th fret on the B, and that's going to change it to an E minor 7 sharp 5. So with the fret hand, it's really not that hard because we're just adding, one note. But with the picking hand, that's where the action is. And, it basically looks and sounds like this. And there you can see I'm just kind of alternate picking through that arpeggio pattern. And then it repeats again. And I like taking little simple, ideas like that and using it as a warm-up or an exercise. It kind of keeps your picking hand on its toes, so to speak. And it's not really that hard, for your fretting hand. It's kind of waking up the picking hand, and then you're kind of saving, that picking, or the fretting hand rather, for something else. Right, now the next idea comes from the solo, and you can find this on the live version or on the studio version too. And this really is just to demonstrate Gary Moore's attack, and this kind of aggressive, playing style that he's, very well known for. And a lot of it has to do, once again, with picking. You're going to kind of dig in, and you're going to pick a lot harder than you normally would. And that's really going to make notes and phrases that you play pop out. You're accenting or you're emphasizing, these notes. So it's just a bending phrase, kind of higher on the fretboard. And there we're really digging in. And if I turn my volume off, you can probably hear it. Well, I'm really, aggressively picking. I'm not lightly, picking. I'm really, really digging in there. And that's something you can hear from Gary Moore and a ton of guitarists, Stevie Ray Vaughan, and, there's a ton of players like that where they really dig in, and really hit the strings. So if you have something that's really, building up or expressive, maybe there's a build up in the solo or it's moving to this melodic, pattern, experiment with that. Pick notes a little more aggressively or a lot harder than you normally would, and it makes things kind of jump out. And that's a really important thing from studying, some of Gary Moore's music, is that really aggressive feel and that staccato and kind of accented phrasing. Alright, the next idea from the solo is this kind of wild, like open string pull-off lick. And definitely Gary Moore influenced a ton of players into this, area of phrasing and this type of playing. And it looks and sounds like this. And basically, he's moving through octaves, kind of linking octaves there. So slowly. And then he does the same thing an octave lower. And the second time through it. And then he does the first pattern again. And now what I went ahead and did is I kind of took his idea and I went ahead and fleshed it out and connected it to the next octave. So this is kind of another bonus lick here. Something like that, and I'm just continuing that pattern. little secret with those type of licks. You know, anytime you're doing those wild, you know, kind of pull-off licks, you know, stuff like, you know, anything like that. You can hear, you know, Randy Rhoads and Kirk Hammett, a ton of players doing stuff like that. But anytime you hear that kind of phrasing, you know, those fast open string pull-offs, muting is essential. You have to mute and dampen around those strings. So with this idea, you know, kind of the hidden secret or the trick is muting, you know, when you move from string to string. So that first lick, you know, and there I'm actually fanning the fingers out too, and I'm using every fret hand finger. And Gary didn't play it that way, but I went ahead and made it, you know, kind of an extra challenge or an exercise by incorporating every fret hand finger, you know, on that first pattern there. And then on the B string, you're going to move, and I'm actually using, you know, my middle finger. You can also use your third finger or maybe even your pinky, and you're going to dampen that high E string. And then when you move to the B string, it's going to be muted right there. And then do the same thing on the G. And I'm kind of moving, you know, my fingers over with my pick. And that way you can kind of keep the ringing strings and the extra noise at a minimum, and you can really hear just the pull-ups. Something like that. All right, the last idea here from the solo involves pivot arpeggios, and this is another area that Gary influenced, you know, a ton of players after him. People like Steve Vai, Nuno Bettencourt, and a bunch of other players too. But this is a really common and familiar and kind of popular, you know, lick. And I love tracing these licks back to the source, and, you know, all signs kind of point to Gary Moore. And I actually wrote an article or a lesson for Guitar Player magazine. This would have been the holiday 2017 issue, and it was called Learning to Fly. And I talked about this lick and talked about Steve Vai and Nuno too. So this is basically an arpeggio, is what we're going to be doing here. And you can think of it as an E minor 6, and it looks and sounds like this. And right there, we're basically doing this. And there's your pivot right there. You know, it's between that B and C note on the D string. And then what Gary does is he moves down a half step, and now it's an E flat minor 6. And he takes that and moves up an octave and does the exact same thing an octave higher. Now that lick, you can definitely catch Steve Vai doing that. He's been doing that for a long time, and he usually taps too. You know, that kind of thing, where he's doing that same arpeggio. You know, it's in a different position there. That's kind of a Steve Vai variation. But I really do like that style of arpeggios. You know, it's busy and fast, and it creates this like blurry sound. And you can move that all over the place. You can do it on different sets of strings, higher and lower, obviously, in different positions. And it's cool. You know, you can kind of follow the Steve Vai idea and tap, or you can, do what Gary and Nuno did and kind of move it around. And Nuno was expanding it, into other tonalities and other keys too, like this. Or something like that. All right, that's going to wrap this look at 3 licks from Gary Moore from 1982. And please leave some feedback and comments and subscribe to Late Night Lessons. And I'll be back before you know it with more material. Thank you.